During the general election campaign, the Labour Party promised to tackle the issue of violence against women and girls, and I welcome that. I think there's definitely a need for that. Um, Recently, in the wake of the riots, Yvette Cooper has proposed tackling misogyny online in the same vein as other forms of extremism like far right extremism and Islamist extremism. And she's spoken about a pattern of behaviour that is involved. Um, Now, this certainly warrants some discussion and analysis because when a government puts forward legislation and it passes, it's very hard to turn back. So I've long argued that any new piece of legislation needs to be very closely scrutinised. It's actually where the House of Lords does play some role. Um, so let's first of all look at the issues at hand. Misogyny means hatred of women and girls. Um, there is a problem in society with, for example, domestic violence victims have too long not been treated the way they should be, in the sense that if a man kills a partner, a wife, or a girlfriend in the house, he will not be given as severe a sentence as if a stranger killed her when she's walking down an alleyway, for example. To be fair to Labour, they're trying to fix that. There's issues around if the weapon is on hand or if it's brought in, i.e., if he kills her with, say, a kitchen knife or something. There's been some high-profile cases in recent years of young women being murdered, in some cases by members of the police, which has, of course, exposed police to their culture, misogyny. Um, I do think the police have that problem. I also think the armed forces do. And these are not things I dismiss because they can ruin lives. And I also think that there's been too many examples of women who have been, hospitalized by a violent partner, and the thug in question has basically got a tap on the wrist. There's been too many examples of that happening. So I do think there's a problem in society with this. Um, the number of women who are killed by men are far, far higher than the number of men killed by women. That's not to say that that or never happens. And I think a female murderer shouldn't be given any more leniency than a male murderer, unless it's absolutely a case of self defense, and that can be proven in the court of law. The problem is often in those situations, if we've had this tendency that a man has been killed and the woman says she was forced to do it out of self defense. The problem is the victim can't defend himself. He can't say, he can't defend his reputation. And it would be quite easy for a woman murderer to just use that excuse, because she had a bad temper and she snapped or what have you. There's been a number of high profile cases of situations like that. Um, the thing about misogyny, it's got a particular definition. It's hatred of women and girls. But when you're saying, and when there's calls to criminalise misogyny, it's not a new thing entirely. A few years ago, Nottinghamshire police were proposing this. My concern with it is it could be sweeping. So who gets to define it? I mean, frankly, there are feminists out there who will say that any sort of dislike of a woman, that disliking an individual woman should be lumped in the same category as generically hating all women, for example. um, what's to say that if you have a couple that are arguing, and let's say it's quite heated, as sometimes happens, I'm not talking about violence here, I'm talking about a heated argument. Let's say she calls him a bastard, and he calls her a bitch, right? I'm spelling it out because I don't want to be sanctioned by YouTube. But under a sweeping definition of misogyny, he would be punished, but she isn't. Now that's hardly fair. Um, I'm not talking about situations where there's clear violence or coercive control, that sort of thing. I do think that people who are engaged in that need to be held to account. It can ruin lives. It can really create an atmosphere of fear and misery for the victim. Um, And I do think it's a disgrace that too many female victims of domestic violence don't see the justice that they should see. It's the same in serious sexual crimes. Um, the conviction rate is appallingly low, and I don't accept that that's, some might say, oh, well, it's a lot of, like, it hasn't been proven, or, um, it's a lot of false accusers. I don't think that's the case at all. I do think women have been let down too often by justice in those cases, not least because of the court's backlog. Yes, there have also been false accusers, and I think women who lie about something like that should go to prison. Um, but this question of misogyny, it really does have to be clearly defined, and that's the point I keep coming back to, because you could have a situation where some feminists will say every crime against a woman must be misogyny. Well, what if you have a mugger and they attack a woman to get her purse and money because he or she is trying to feed a drug habit? Now, can you say misogyny is the motivation there? I would say no, it's not. The drug habit's the motivation. Greed is the motivation. So designating every crime against a woman, or where a woman happens to be the victim, as motivated by misogyny is a bit like saying if a minority person is a victim of crime, it must be racism. I think in a court of law, you need to prove that misogyny was a motivating factor, i.e., is a man being violent towards a woman because she is a woman? I think violence against women is abhorrent, but I do think if you're going to make a generic piece of legislation that's criminalised misogyny, it needs to be understood in a particular context, i.e., it needs to be clearly defined. Otherwise, you are going to have a sweeping situation where men are going to find themselves subject to be treated as an extremist, maybe not necessarily arrested or having any police interaction, but regarded as an extremist simply because they've, for example, criticised feminism. That is clearly absurd. In one of the Nordic states a few years ago, I think it was Sweden, not 100% sure, I think it was Sweden, there were feminist groups actually trying to make it a criminal offence to criticise feminism. That is dangerously stupid, because that is like saying it will be a criminal offence to criticise socialism or conservatism or what have you. I don't think any ideology should be above critique or scrutiny, particularly regarding how its adherents carry that ideology out. Um, so that for me is a very big issue. How is it defined? Who gets to define it? Because we've had cases where the police have followed up on non-crime hate incidents that, in my view, they have no business doing. It's a waste of police resources. No one should be, if put it this way, if something is not a criminal offence, the police have no business getting involved. I don't think the police should be knocking on people's doors because they use the wrong pronoun. By the same token, I don't think the police would have any business knocking on someone's door, um, because in a moment's frustration, he called a woman online a bitch, right? I'm not saying people should do that, but clearly there has to be some common sense involved. Now, if it's a pattern of behaviour, there may be something in that. We know that more often than not, misogyny does manifest in violence. The Plymouth mass shooting in 2021, misogyny was said to be one of the motivating factors there, and that was a very violent incident, 6 people killed. It was a rare example of a mass shooting in this country, but misogyny was a factor. And in the United States, there's been mass shooting where incel um, ideology was a motivating factor. And in Canada, so I certainly wouldn't totally dismiss this. Um, but then on the incel issue, it's no good just condemning these guys and saying they're awful. Let's throw them in prison. I think if they cross the line, they should be. But one thing that isn't looked at is why are these young men gravitating to those sort of groups in the first place? I do think feminists, I would never ever blame women for misogyny. That is, the responsibility of misogynistic men. But I do think feminists haven't helped by the constant shaming of men, because a young guy who's told that he is who he's constantly shamed, he may well gravitate to someone like Andrew Tate. Likewise, guys who haven't had sexual experience, what is the attitude from both men and women? And it has to be said by other men, the attitude is ridicule. He's a loser. He's a virgin. Um, this is something I take seriously because if they're feeling lonely and angry, the chances are they will start going down the wrong path and they'll start blaming women for that. Then they'll go down a misogynistic route. And, in the worst case scenario, they could then become another shooter like the guy in Plymouth. So this is something that should absolutely be taken seriously. But I don't think the approach, I don't think this ridicule is the right approach. That isn't going to get, that isn't going to de-radicalize those young men who are taken in by the likes of Andrew Tate. Um, so we in the West, I think we need to change this attitude. That if what I would say to those young guys is, look, people who boast about sexual experience are full of it. In all likelihood, they haven't had as much sexual experience as they claim. Also, if you haven't had that experience, maybe you've just been unlucky. You just need to be patient. You'll meet the right person, but don't go down a path of saying it's the fault of women or all women are stuck up or something like that. That is not true. You can't generalize women and say they're all the same. So I would really try to push back against the misogynistic ideas that they may be feeling. But I think if they're getting ridiculed, they're not going to see the light. They're only going to get more bitter. So I don't think that's the right approach at all. Um, I'm going to conclude this, but there's another thing, when legislation is brought in, there may be male MPs who say, I'm not going to vote for this because I've got concerns about the way it is defined in this sort of sweeping way. And then they'll be accused of, what will happen. They'll be accused by feminist groups of standing in the way of progress. But it may not be that they're against it in principle. It may just be that they're saying, look, let's define this very clearly. If a crime or an ideology is clearly motivated by hatred of women, that is not disagreeing with a woman and it's not disliking an individual woman, right? Um, it may be that there's a pattern of behavior where that guy is frequenting incel sites, that he is constantly talking about women in a very disparaging way, that he's constantly coming out with misogynistic rants. Then maybe there is a case that he needs to be monitored the way the security services would with a far right or Islamist extremist. But I would say that it is very, very important that this is very specific. Otherwise, you're going to get a situation where it's rife for abuse. And frankly, I think there are some feminists out there who would make it really, really broad. Like disagreeing with a woman makes you a misogynist. I do think there's feminists out there who have that attitude because as a term it is thrown around a lot, I believe. Now, there's situations such as domestic violence um, or stalking of women, that sort of thing, extreme misogyny coming from incel groups, that should all be taken seriously. Um, but we have to be careful that this doesn't trample free speech. People are allowed to dislike each other, people are allowed to disagree. Um, the red line, obviously, is making threats. Um, I know Jess Phillips and Yvette Cooper have said this isn't an attack on free speech, but it really has to be how it's defined. And if you have a crime, the onus must be proving that misogyny is the intent.